I was standing on the stone walkway in front of my mother's house in Savannah, Georgia. Late afternoon sun poured honey gold through the rose hedge, and the air tasted like warm earth and something sweet I had forgotten the name of. I stepped out of my car and saw her Elliot Greer running from the garden next door, blonde hair catching the wind, one hand held high with a purple beaded bracelet between her fingers. I made that bracelet for her 24 years ago. She smiled, and the first words out of her mouth were, "Does the promise still count?" I did not know what she meant. But telling you this now, I understand every single word. My name is Marcus Ellison. I am 32 years old, and I work as a structural engineer for a consulting firm based in Charlotte, North Carolina. I design load-bearing systems for commercial buildings, hospitals, parking decks, bridges. It is precise work, and I have always been comfortable inside the logic of it. Numbers behave. Steel behaves. People are harder. My marriage lasted 3 years. No children. We ended it 2 years ago, not with yelling or lawyers, but with a long exhale and 2 signatures on a Tuesday afternoon. We wanted different lives. She wanted weekend trips and dinner parties. I wanted quiet and a porch. Neither of us was wrong. We were just wrong for each other. Now I live alone in a 2-bedroom apartment with a gray cat named Blueprint, who sleeps on my drafting table and stares at me like he is waiting for me to figure something out. Life is fine. That is the word I use when people ask, but say it enough times and you hear how hollow it sounds. I grew up in Savannah, the South Side, in a neighborhood where the houses sat close and the yards ran into each other. Somebody's grandmother was always on a porch somewhere, and you could smell 3 different dinners just by walking down the block. The Greers lived next door, pale blue house, white shutters, and a yard full of rose bushes that Elliot's grandmother tended every morning. Elliot Greer was 2 years younger than me, small, blonde, barefoot from April through October. We played together from about 4 or 5, catching fireflies in mason jars, building blanket forts between the couch and the dining table, splitting popsicles on the back steps, while the juice dried sticky on our elbows. The summer I turned 8, I sat on the grass with my mother's craft kit and strung together a bracelet made of small purple beads. Elliot was 6. She sat cross-legged across from me, watching every bead go on. When I finished and slipped it on her wrist, it was way too big. It slid to her elbow, and she laughed so hard, she fell onto the grass. Then she sat up, held it in place, and said, "If we both grow up and neither of us gets married, we should marry each other." I laughed. I nodded. I tied the last knot and thought absolutely nothing of it. That is what promises are at 8 years old. Words shaped like games, light as air, gone before dinner. That fall, my family moved to Atlanta for my father's job. Elliot and I wrote letters for a while, crayon drawings at first, then shorter notes, then nothing. The letters stopped the way rivers dry up, gradually, until one day the bed is empty. I went through high school, college, a master's program, a marriage, a divorce. 24 years. I never went back to Savannah. Then my mother called. 65, just out of knee surgery. Come home for 2 weeks and fix the porch railing before I fall through it and sue myself. That is my mother, every request wrapped in a joke so you cannot say no. I put in for leave, loaded Blueprint into his carrier, and drove 7 hours south. When I pulled in, the railing was worse than she described, wood soft and splitting, paint peeling in long curls. I stepped out and stood still. The air hit me, cut grass, damp soil, the faint sweetness of roses next door. I looked right, same pale blue house, same white fence leaning left, same garden in bloom, and Elliot came running out with the bracelet held up like a small purple flag. That evening at the kitchen table, I asked my mother, casual as I could, "The Greers still next door?" She did not look up. Elliot has been there since before her grandmother passed. Close to a year now. That girl asks about you all the time. She said it like weather. I took it the same way. But you knew, did you not? I stepped out of that car, drew one breath of cut grass and warm Georgia dirt, the smell of 8 years old. And for a moment I was not 32, divorced and hollow. I was just a boy coming home. 2 weeks in Savannah. That was the deal. Fix the railing, paint the porch, replace the hinges on the screen door, and drive back to Charlotte. Simple work, honest work, the kind of work that makes your hands sore in a good way. Elliot appeared on day one. She came through the gate between our yards carrying a tray of peach cobbler, the old-fashioned kind, with the crumbly brown sugar top and peach syrup pooling at the edges. She handed it to my mother and said, "Miss Lorraine just had surgery. She needs somebody cooking real food, not whatever Marcus is going to burn." My mother laughed, took the tray, and invited Elliot to stay for dinner without asking me. Elliot sat at the kitchen table that night, her chair pulled close, her elbows on the wood, laughing as she told stories about the children's ward at the hospital. And somewhere between the cobbler and the coffee, I realized that the barefoot 6-year-old I had left behind had become a woman I did not recognize and could not stop looking at. Elliot was a pediatric nurse at Memorial Health, 30 years old, never married. She had moved back to Savannah almost a year earlier to take care of her grandmother, who had been diagnosed with late-stage kidney disease. She spent months at her grandmother's bedside adjusting medications, cooking soft meals, reading aloud from the same romance novels her grandmother had kept on the nightstand for 40 years. Her grandmother passed 6 months before I arrived. Elliot stayed. When I asked why she did not go back to Atlanta, where she had been working before, she shrugged and said, "It just feels right here, familiar." She said it like it was simple. I believed her, but I noticed every single day that she wore the purple beaded bracelet on her left wrist. The same one. The beads were faded. The elastic cord had been retied at least twice, but it was the same bracelet I had made on the grass when I was 8. I never asked about it. I assumed it was a habit, a piece of nostalgia, nothing more. The audience knows better. I did not. On day 3, I was in the front yard sawing lumber for the new railing. The sun was high, and the sweat was running into my eyes. Elliot walked over from next door, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade with mint leaves floating on top. She sat on the porch steps and handed me a glass, and we started talking. We talked about the neighborhood, about the old neighbors who had moved or passed away, about the oak tree at the end of the block that had survived 3 hurricanes. Then she asked about my marriage. I told her the honest version short. No blame, no drama. 2 people who loved each other enough to let go cleanly. Elliot listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. The ice in her glass cracked. A mockingbird called from the oak tree. Then she said, "Some people wait their whole lives to find the right person, Marcus. There is nothing wrong with that." I nodded. I thought she was being kind, the way nurses are kind professionally, instinctively. I did not understand that she was speaking about herself. I did not hear the weight behind those words. But you heard it. On day 5, my mother asked Elliot to drive her to a follow-up appointment at the orthopedic clinic. I stayed behind and started painting the porch. I had bought white paint the same color it had always been. When they came back, my mother settled into her chair and said, "Elliot thinks you should do it in sage green. She says it would catch the afternoon light." I looked at the half-finished white coat on the railing. I looked at the can. The next morning I drove to the hardware store and came back with a gallon of sage green. I did not think about why I did it. I just did. But you see it. I know you do. Elliot was choosing the color of my mother's house. She was placing herself into the texture of this home, one quiet decision at a time, and I was letting her without understanding what it meant. On day 7, I went into the garage to find a box of screws. Behind my father's old fishing rods and a stack of water-damaged magazines, I found a tin box I had not seen in 24 years. The lid was rusted shut. I pried it open with a flathead screwdriver. Inside were 3 things. A Polaroid photograph of Elliot and me, maybe 6 and 8 years old, standing in the backyard with popsicle stains on our shirts and the sun behind us. A wooden popsicle stick with the letters M + E = forever scratched into the surface in shaky, childish handwriting. And a second bracelet unfinished. 4 purple beads threaded onto a piece of elastic cord, never tied off. I remembered instantly. I had been making a matching one for myself. I wanted us to wear them as a pair, but my family moved before I could finish it. The cord sat in my palm, the beads still bright after all those years. I picked up the popsicle stick, smiled, took a photo, and texted it to Elliot. 3 minutes later, her reply came. 2 words. "You kept it." Just that. No emoji, no exclamation point. Just 2 words that, if I had been paying closer attention, I would have heard trembling. but I was not paying attention. Not yet. On day 9, a storm hit Savannah hard. The rain came sideways, and by evening, water was dripping through Elliot's ceiling in 2 places. She called me, and I walked over in the downpour with a tarp, a bucket, and a flashlight. I spent 2 hours in the crawl space above her ceiling, patching the leak while thunder rattled the windows. When I finally climbed down the ladder, Elliot was standing at the bottom, both hands gripping the sides to hold it steady. As I stepped off the last rung, her fingers grazed my ankle just barely, just for a fraction of a second. She did not say anything. She just turned and walked into the kitchen and made coffee. I stood in her living room, dripping on the hardwood, and looked around. The shelves were lined with children's books, picture books, early readers, chapter books with cracked spines. On the top shelf, a framed photograph of her grandmother, smiling in a garden, and at eye level, in a small glass frame, a photograph of Elliot and me at 6 and 8, squinting into the sun. It was placed at the exact height where you would see it every time you walked past. I felt something move inside my chest, not a thought, not a word, just a shift, like a door opening 1 inch in a house you thought was locked. I could not name it yet, but it was there. On day 11 we walked to the river in the late afternoon. The water was low and slow, and the light turned the surface to gold. We sat on the bank, and Elliot told me about her grandmother's last months, about reading to her, about adjusting her pillows, about the morning she found the bed empty and the book still open on the nightstand. Her grandmother had said something to her once, near the end. "That girl is waiting for something, and I do not know what it is." Elliot laughed when she told me, softly, and said her grandmother worried too much. I asked, without thinking, "So, what are you waiting for?" She turned her head and looked out at the river. She did not answer. She just reached down and turned the bracelet on her wrist, slowly, bead by bead, the way someone touches a rosary. I thought she was thinking about her grandmother. I thought the silence was grief. Now, I know she was sitting next to the answer and could not say it out loud. That night, back at my mother's house, I opened my laptop. There was an email from my firm, a new project, a hospital expansion in Charlotte, and they wanted me back sooner than planned. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I closed the laptop and said nothing. Not to my mother, not to Elliot. I was not ready to think about leaving yet, and I did not understand why the thought of it felt like something tearing. On day 12, a white SUV pulled into Elliot's driveway around noon. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a woman I had never seen before, tall, sharp-jawed, wearing oversized sunglasses pushed up on her forehead, and moving with the kind of energy that announces itself before it arrives. This was Corinne Greer, Elliot's younger sister. 26 years old, living in Jacksonville, working in commercial real estate, and carrying opinions the way other people carry luggage heavily and everywhere. She walked straight into the house without knocking. I happened to be inside, reattaching a bookshelf that had pulled away from the plaster wall. Corinne looked at me. She looked at the drill in my hand. She looked at the shelf. Then she turned to Elliot, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, and said, in a voice that could cut glass, "So this is why you will not sell the house." Elliot said nothing. I said nothing. The drill whirred down to silence in my hand, and the room got very still. Corinne stayed for 2 days, and in those 2 days, she took every truth I had been too blind to see and sharpened it into a blade. I want to be clear about something. Corinne was not cruel for the sake of cruelty. She was not a villain in the cartoon sense. She was the kind of person who believed that honesty without softening was still a virtue, and that protecting her sister from a fantasy was more loving than letting her live inside it. She wanted Elliot to sell the grandmother's house, split the money, and move somewhere with a future. She wanted her sister to stop waiting for something that was never coming. The problem was that I was standing in the kitchen holding a drill, and I looked exactly like the thing Corinne was trying to protect her sister from. The first evening, my mother invited both Greer sisters over for dinner. We sat around the kitchen table, fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, and attention thick enough to chew. The conversation stayed light for the first 20 minutes. Corinne asked about my job, about Charlotte, about what kind of buildings I designed. She was polite, almost warm. Then, halfway through the meal, she set her fork down with a deliberate click and said, in a voice as calm as a closing argument, "My sister happened to stay in Savannah right when you happened to come back, Marcus. You do not find that a little strange?" The table went quiet. I could hear the kitchen clock ticking. I smiled, the kind of smile you use when you do not have an answer and do not want anyone to know. Under the table, my mother placed her hand on my knee and squeezed firm, deliberate. She knew, she had known for a while, and she wanted me to keep my mouth shut. So I did. After dinner, Corinne found me alone on the front porch. The night was warm and the streetlight threw shadows across the new sage-green railing. She leaned against it, crossed her arms, and I could tell she had been preparing this conversation since Jacksonville. "My sister has kept that purple bracelet for 24 years, Marcus. She wore it every single day. She turned down 3 good men, a teacher who adored her, a pharmacist she dated for 8 months, and a guy who flew in from Denver twice a month just to take her to dinner because none of them were you. You think that is friendship? She is betting her entire life on a promise made by an 8-year-old boy who moved away and never once looked back." Her voice was level, almost clinical. Not a single raised syllable, and every word she said was true. That was the part that burned the worst. It was not exaggeration. It was not spite. It was a plain, uncomfortable truth laid out on the porch railing between us. Elliot had organized her entire adult life around a promise I had forgotten the day I left Savannah, and I had been sitting beside her for 12 days without seeing it. I felt something crack inside my chest, not pain exactly, but the sound a wall makes when it starts to give. The next morning, I was in my mother's kitchen pouring coffee, when I heard voices through the open window, Corinne and Elliot, in the grandmother's house next door. Corinne's voice was rising. "You left your job in Atlanta. You moved back to this little town. You fixed up Grandma's house from the inside out just so you would have a reason to stay. And for what? For hope? That is not a life plan, Elliot. That is a fairy tale. And you are too old for fairy tales." There was a long silence. Then Elliot's voice, quiet, steady, and final, said 4 words. "You do not understand." Nothing after that. Corinne kept talking. Her voice went on, rising and falling. Elliot's did not come again. I stood at the window holding my coffee and thought about how silence can be louder than any argument when it comes from someone who has already said the only thing that matters. That night I lay on the narrow bed in my childhood room, staring up at the glow-in-the-dark stars I had pressed onto the ceiling when I was 10. Half of them had fallen off over the years. The ones that remained glowed faintly green in the darkness. And I lay there looking at them and asked myself a question I had been avoiding for 12 days. What kind of man lets a woman wait 24 years without ever once turning around to check if she is still standing there? If Elliot had truly been waiting, and now I believe she had, then I had been failing her every single day. Not with cruelty, not with intention, but with something worse. Blindness, carelessness, the quiet betrayal of a man who never thought to look behind him. Corinne left the next morning. But before she got in her car, she walked across the grass to where I was standing on my mother's porch. She looked me in the face, no sunglasses, no armor, and said, "If you do not love my sister, then tell her. Say it clearly, to her face. Do not let her guess for one more day." She held my eyes for 3 seconds, then turned and got in the SUV. The gravel crunched under her tires as she pulled away. That sentence, "do not let her guess," pressed itself into my skull and would not leave. Elliot did not come over that day. No text, no call, no cobbler, no lemonade on the porch steps. The house next door was dark by 7 in the evening. I stood at my mother's kitchen window and looked across at Elliot's living room. The curtains were drawn tight, but through a narrow gap at the bottom, I could see the windowsill, and there, laid flat against the white paint, was the purple bracelet. She had taken it off. That image stayed behind my eyelids all night. I sat on the porch until past midnight, listening to crickets and the distant sound of the river, and I thought about a 6-year-old girl who watched a boy string purple beads and decided, right then, that he was the one. And I thought about how that boy grew up, moved away, married someone else, and never once looked back to see who was still standing by the fence. Day 13. I walked across the yard to Elliot's front door and knocked. The morning was already warm, the kind of Georgia heat that sits on your shoulders like a hand. No answer. I knocked again, harder. Nothing. I tried the doorbell. I pulled out my phone and called her. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I sat down on her porch steps, put my elbows on my knees, folded my hands together, and waited. 40 minutes passed. The sun moved across the yard and climbed the porch railing. A cardinal landed on the rose bush by the gate, sat for a moment and flew away. Then Elliot's car turned into the driveway. She stepped out carrying a bag from the hospital she had gone in for an early shift, the kind that starts before dawn. Her eyes were slightly red, the skin beneath them shadowed. She saw me on the steps and stopped halfway up the walkway. "You do not need to be here," she said. Her voice was flat and careful, the way a door sounds when someone closes it slowly instead of slamming it. There was no warmth in it. There was no anger either, just distance, the kind that gets built overnight when a person decides to stop hoping. "I need to talk to you," I said. She looked at me for a long moment, the bag hanging from one hand, her keys in the other. Then she walked past me, unlocked the door, and went inside. I followed. The living room was unchanged. Children's books lined the shelves. The grandmother's photograph sat on the top shelf. Our photo, 6 and 8 years old, squinting in the sun, still hung in its glass frame at eye level. But the bracelet was not on her wrist. I looked at the windowsill and saw it lying there, the purple beads dull against the white paint, the elastic cord loose and slack. "Where is the bracelet?" I asked. Elliot looked at her bare wrist the way you look at a spot where something important used to be. She said, "I put it away." Corinne was right. I should not keep holding on to something that belongs to a promise only one person remembers. That sentence hit me harder than anything Corinne had said on the porch. Because this was not Corinne's blunt force honesty. This was Elliot, the woman who always showed up, always smiled, always brought cobbler without being asked, admitting, for the first time in her own quiet voice, that she was in pain, that she had been in pain for a very long time, and that she was ready to stop. I said, "I remember the promise." She looked up. Her eyes were guarded, the kind of careful that comes from being let down so many times you stop trusting the next sentence before it even lands. I said, "I do not remember it because I was 8 and it was fun. I remember it because it was the only promise I ever made that I truly wanted to keep. But life pulled me away before I was old enough to understand what I was leaving behind." She did not move. Her hands hung at her sides, still holding the hospital bag in one and the keys in the other. I said, "I do not know when I fell in love with you. Maybe it was the day you brought lemonade to the porch and the ice cracked in the glass while we were talking. Maybe it was the half-second your fingers touched my ankle at the bottom of the ladder. Maybe it was 24 years ago, when I was sitting on the grass stringing beads onto a cord and not understanding why my hands were being so impossibly careful with every single one." Elliot cried. She did not cover her face. She did not turn away. The tears ran straight down her cheeks, and she let them. Then she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I do not need you to say this because you feel sorry for me." I shook my head. "I am not saying it because I feel sorry. I am saying it because Corinne was right, but right in a way she does not understand. You bet your whole life on one promise, and I am standing here telling you that you won." The room was quiet except for the clock on the wall and the faint sound of a bird outside the window. I told her I needed to go back to Charlotte, the project, the transition, the loose ends, but I was coming back. Not someday, not maybe. I was filing a transfer to the Savannah office that week. Elliot did not say stay. She did not ask me to promise. She had never asked anyone for anything in her life. That was who she was, the kind of person who waited without demanding, who loved without conditions, who held a bracelet for 24 years and never once used it as leverage. I walked to the windowsill, picked up the bracelet, and carried it to where she stood. I took her left hand gently, slipped the bracelet over her fingers, and settled it against her wrist. She looked down at it, and for the first time in 2 days, she smiled. Small and quiet, but real, the kind of smile that has survived something and come out the other side. The clock ticked. The afternoon light came through the thin curtains and fell in pale lines across her hands. The coffee on the kitchen table had gone cold hours ago, and when the bracelet settled against her skin, Elliot exhaled a long, slow breath, the kind you finally let go after holding it for 24 years. I drove back to Charlotte the following morning. The apartment felt different when I walked in, smaller, quieter, as though the walls had drawn closer while I was gone. Blueprint was sitting on the drafting table, watching me with the steady gaze of a cat who has been waiting for his owner to arrive at an obvious conclusion. I set down my bag. He blinked once. I chose to believe it was affection. I filed the transfer request that same week. Every evening at 9 o'clock, I called Elliot on video. She would be on the couch with a medical textbook open in her lap, a pen tucked behind her ear, and a cup of tea going cold on the side table. I would be at the kitchen counter with blueprints spread in front of me and a pencil I kept forgetting to put down. We did not say, "I miss you." We did not say, "I wish you were here." We just called every single night. At 9, Blueprint would climb onto my lap facing the screen, and Elliot would laugh and say, "Your cat looks at me like he knows something." He did. I am entirely convinced of it. The transfer came through in 5 weeks. I packed the apartment into boxes, loaded Blueprint into the carrier one more time, and drove 7 hours south on the same highway, past the same exits, into the same Georgia air. I rented a small house 2 blocks from my mother's place, not Elliot's house. That was deliberate. We had waited 24 years to get here, and I was not about to rush the last mile. We were going to do this slowly, properly, in the way 2 people should when they understand that love is not a sprint, but a rhythm you learn together, step by step. We dated the way you date when you are 32, and have already survived 1 marriage, and know that love is not a firework but a long, steady flame you tend with both hands. Dinners at the Riverside restaurant, where the shrimp came with grits so creamy they could make you forget your own name. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, where Elliot examined tomatoes with the precision of a surgeon and I carried the canvas bags without complaint and pretended I had opinions about peaches. Afternoons on the riverbank, side by side with our books, hers medical, mine structural, sitting close enough that our shoulders touched but never closer than that, because closeness, when it follows 24 years of distance, is something you earn 1 inch at a time. I did not kiss her for the first 3 weeks. Not because I did not want to. I wanted to every time she laughed at something I said. That was not even funny. Every time she reached across the table to wipe hot sauce off my chin without asking. I held back because I wanted Elliot to understand, in her bones, that this time the boy who walked away had walked all the way back. The first kiss came on a Friday evening, month 2, on my mother's front porch. We had just finished dinner, my mother's pot roast, the one she makes when she is showing off. My mother was inside, washing the same 3 plates for the 4th time, pretending she was not watching through the kitchen window. Elliot was sitting on the top step, and I was standing 1 step below, which made us exactly the same height. She said something about the fireflies, how they seemed brighter this year, and I leaned in. She smiled against my lips, and 24 years of distance dissolved like sugar in warm water. Inside the kitchen, I am fairly certain my mother dropped a plate on purpose. By month 5, Corinne came to visit. She walked into Elliot's house and found me reattaching that same stubborn bookshelf. It had pulled away from the wall again, because the plaster was old and the house was older. She looked at me with a drill in one hand and a level in the other. She looked at the purple bracelet on Elliot's wrist. She looked at Blueprint, curled into a tight gray circle on the sofa, as though he held the deed to the property. Corinne did not apologize. That was not her way, but she set a bottle of wine on the kitchen counter and said, "I am glad I was wrong." That was Corinne's version of love, sharp-edged, grudging, and honest. I respected it. The following year, I proposed. I did it in the front garden of my mother's house, on the same stone walkway where Elliot had come running with the bracelet held high on the day I first arrived. I did not buy a diamond ring. I went to the garage and took out the old tin box. Inside was the unfinished bracelet, the one I had started for myself at 8 years old. 4 beads on a string, never tied off. I sat at the kitchen table the night before and finished it. Bead by bead, 24 years late, I completed what the boy had never gotten to complete. At the end of the strand, I added 1 new bead, sage green, the exact color Elliot had chosen for my mother's porch railing. I slipped the finished bracelet onto my own wrist, walked out to the garden where Elliot was standing among the roses in the late afternoon light, and got down on 1 knee on the warm stone. 24 years ago, I made you one, I said. Now I finally finished mine. Will you wear them with me as a pair? She cried. I cried. My mother stood in the window with both hands pressed to her chest, smiling so wide I could see it from across the yard. The wedding was small. 30 people in my mother's backyard, the rose hedge in full bloom. The afternoon light fell gold through the oak branches, the same light, the same angle, as the evening I first drove back to Savannah. Corinne stood as maid of honor. My mother walked me down the stone path with her arm through mine, her new knee steady beneath her. Elliot was waiting at the end of the walkway with the original purple bracelet on her wrist, faded, retied but whole. I stood beside her with the completed one on mine, purple and sage-green beads catching the late light. I looked at her and thought, 24 years, 2 children on a lawn, one promise no one else believed in. And today is the day it comes true. At the reception, Corinne walked up to me carrying a glass of champagne. If I had not said what I said that day on the porch, she said, "Would you have figured it out on your own?" I laughed, "Probably not." She nodded once, firmly, and raised her glass. "Then, I am the hero of this story." I did not argue. She was not entirely wrong. Sometimes I watch Elliot sleep, and I think about the 8-year-old boy who sat on the grass on a summer afternoon and strung purple beads onto a piece of elastic cord. That boy did not know what he was promising. He did not know that words said in sunlight can carry the weight of a whole life. But the 6-year-old girl sitting across from him, she knew. She understood even then, and she kept that promise for both of them, for 24 years, in silence. Some people love loudly with gifts, with grand gestures, with words that fill a room, and some people love by wearing a faded purple bracelet every single day, saying nothing, asking for nothing, waiting quietly for the one person they chose at 6 years old to finally find his way home. I was not worthy of that patience, but I will spend the rest of my life becoming worthy of it, one day at a time, one bead at a time. The 2 bracelets sit in a glass frame on our bookshelf now, next to the Polaroid of us at 6 and 8, next to our wedding photo, next to a picture of Blueprint curled between 2 pillows, like the cat who engineered the whole thing. Every morning I walk past that frame and press my fingers to the glass. Not because I have forgotten, because I never want to. Sometimes the most beautiful promise is not the one you remember making. It is the one someone kept for you, quietly, faithfully, until you were finally ready to come home. Have you ever had someone keep a promise for you that you never even knew about? And if it were you, would you have the courage to go back for a promise made 24 years ago? If this story touched something in you, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you for being here.